Hello, this is Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, joined by Sheldon Richmond, vice president of the foundation, and this is the Libertarian Angle. We're going to talk to you a little bit about income taxation and that government agency that we've all come to love, the Internal Revenue Service. We see, of course, the latest scandal. It's a funny thing about the welfare warfare state. If you notice, there's always scandals and crises and chaos in our lives. It's not a coincidence. But here we have the IRS, it turns out, that is using its powers to focus in on groups for political reasons, this being the Tea Party group. Nothing new. I mean, this is what the IRS, this is one of its primary purposes, is to serve as an enforcement vehicle for the government to keep people in line, to have that threat of audits over them, the threat of violating some kind of rules and regulations of the tax code. And we've seen this throughout the history of the IRS. I mean, the Kennedy and Johnson administrations were notorious for this. Johnson would just send out. In fact, there's a great story in Robert Caro's latest volume on Johnson, where there were people, calling for investigating Johnson for the scandals in Congress, the bribery and so forth, influence peddling. And Johnson just called the newspaper editor and said, if you don't want the IRS coming down on your executives and the owners of your corporation, shut down the investigation. And of course, they shut down the investigation. But what we really want to do here is always take things to a higher level, which is really what distinguishes libertarians and conservatives. I mean, conservatives are jumping on this thing big time, but they're calling for investigation, same old nonsense. But really, what we libertarians want is a free society, which involves eliminating the IRS, the income tax, and all the welfare warfare junk that they fund. What do you think, Sheldon?
Well, sure, you can't really judge this particular episode, the scandal, in a vacuum. It's interesting. You can delve into it at a more of a surface level, and there's still interesting things going on. It seems pretty flagrant that this office in Cincinnati, which was put in charge of these applications for nonprofit status, decided to look at organizations that had the name Tea Party or Patriot or proposing smaller government. They decided to look at those groups to the exclusion of other groups in this vigilance. So that's sort of interesting. I mean, it does seem like a flagrant use of the IRS for political purposes. And you can speculate about, is this an order that came from on high? Was it an atmosphere created by things the Obama administration had been saying, in the build up to the election, and attacking a Supreme Court ruling that lets corporations and unions, give money to independent efforts to promote candidates. You have all these issues that are very, very interesting, but really it does come down to this. Since the government taxes incomes, it also is in the position of authority to grant exemptions. If you beg and petition the government to be exempted in some respect from taxes, the government may let you do it. But, of course, you have to fulfill the government's, and when I say government, I really mean Congress. We can blame the IRS, but the IRS is just an agency that carries out Congress's will. I mean, I really don't think we should demonize the IRS that much. That lets Congress off the hook. Congress could end it all tomorrow if it wanted to. However, once the government's taxing incomes, it then has the power to set rules about what they'll exempt. So some activities it can encourage by exempting income taxation from certain kind of organizations, and other kind of activities it doesn't exempt. That's a lot of power. That's a huge amount of power, but it's all based on the power to tax in the first place. Take away the one, and then you've taken away the other.
Yeah, and I find it interesting that people have to ask for permission to be tax exempt, and they have these criteria for being tax exempt, because the real core of a free society is where everybody's tax exempt. And we often forget that the American people lived without an income tax for more than 120 years of our nation's history. This meant that everyone could keep everything he earned, and there wasn't anything the government could do about it. It wasn't by permission, oh, would you please let me keep my money? Our American ancestors understood that being free to keep your own money, your fruits of your earnings, is part of what being free is all about. It's part of being in a free society, and I think we've lost sight of that we've come to accept that, or Americans have, that the income tax is just a necessary, permanent part of life, and that we just have to deal with it as it is. Oh, woe is us that we have this IRS, this tyrannical, terrifying agency in our midst, but this is all just part of life. Well, it's not just part of life, and it's not part of a free society. A free society is one, as our ancestors understood for more than 120 years, is one without this type of agency and this kind of tax in our society.
Well, I would add that there was an income tax for about 10 years, from beginning at the time of the Civil War and then up until about 1872, when the government was then running a surplus, so they let the tax expire during the Grant administration. So we're not totally, pure in this area. The other thing is just to be fair about it, the Constitution did grant the Congress a broad power to tax, which the Supreme Court has always found very all-embracing and comprehensive. And just to put one more thing on the record, the income tax has never been declared unconstitutional, not the tax on wages and salaries. An earlier tax on the income from property was declared unconstitutional, but because it wasn't apportioned. But that's a separate issue, and that's what the 16th Amendment was designed to address. So it was always latent, and people should have been on, and people had proposed the income tax, often throughout American history. But the other side, the opponents of the tax, always used one word in condemning that idea. They said that tax would be inquisitorial. In other words, would just open up the government the power to gather information on people, to demand information. Obviously, if it wants to know how much income you have, you'll have an interest in not being forthright about that. You want to keep your own money. That's natural. The government knows that, and therefore it's going to need ways to find out whether you're hiding any information about your income. So they were right. It would open up a terrible thing. Unfortunately, a bargain with the devil was struck. You had people who were free traders who hated the tariff and were seduced by the idea that if we have a small income tax on the wealthy, we can reduce the tariff or really cut the tariff. Good motive, very bad move, very bad strategic move. Because we have both, of course. We ended up with high tariffs and high income tax.
Yeah, I find it ironic that they were promising that the income tax would never exceed but a very small percentage, and it would be only on the rich. And they were appealing to people's sense of envy and covetousness, that some had more while others had less, and this was unfair. And then, of course, now we live under this tyrannical system. And it really is sort of like an allowance, Sheldon, the way I look at it. I mean, the income tax effectively nationalized income. It made all income in the country subject to the government's control. And so by setting the percentage, they're really just giving us an allowance. They're letting us keep whatever percentage of our income that we produce, which is no different from a parent giving a child a certain allowance. And it has made the citizen the servant, as compared to the way it was before. There was an income tax where the citizen is master and the government is servant. There's no question but that now the government is master. And another point is, I think it's ironic that all this came up at this time, because we just have published the ebook version of your great book that you wrote for us, one of the 3 great books you wrote for us, called Your Money or Your Life, Why We Must Abolish the Income Tax. Would you tell us a little bit about that book, why you wrote it, what the message is there, and why it's such a great book even to this day?
Well, I tried to address the very many levels that you can talk about this. There's a chapter on the history of the income tax, how we ended up with it. There are chapters on the economics of it, what it actually does economically, of course, the moral aspect of it, how it does change the relationship between government and individual, as I just mentioned. They're always suspecting us of not being complete and forthright about what our income is. It sets up this permanent war And so I try to hit all the angles. The new edition also adds 4 articles, which I wrote later, which discuss the 16th Amendment. There's a lot of misunderstanding about the 16th Amendment. People think that in the 1890s, the Supreme Court said that income tax is unconstitutional, and therefore they passed an amendment to cure that. But that is not what the court said. The court only said that a tax on income from property, either real property or personal property like stocks and bonds, was unconstitutional without apportionment. I think that decision was wrong, but that's irrelevant. But they let stand the income tax on wages and salaries. The reason they knocked the whole bill out was they said if we only knock out the one on property, that puts all the burden on wage earners, and that wasn't Congress's intent. So therefore, we knocked the whole thing down, and they basically told Congress to go back and do it over. And then the 16th Amendment later on in 1913 fixed that in a sense so that they can tax the income from property without apportionment. So now we've had that income tax ever since. And you're right, it began. I talk about how the rates changed. It started out very tiny, a couple percentage points on people making huge amounts of money. But then war, of course, turns it into a mass tax. It becomes something of a mass tax during World War I. There's some fallback in the 20s, but then World War II comes along and it becomes a mass tax and has remained that ever since. So I think it's a pretty good summing up of what is wrong when you let government tax incomes, and also try to address the point of view that says there really is no income tax. There's a whole group out there that believes there is no binding tax. Not binding in a moral sense, but I mean, people deny there's even a legally binding tax. And if we just say the right magic words before a judge, somehow it's all going to fall down. And I try to show that's wishful thinking, and then it's not based on any facts.
Yeah, it's a fantastic book for anybody that wants to understand the nature and the history of the income tax in the United States. And Your Money, Your Life is the book to get. Another aspect, Sheldon, is that they make the tax code so complicated that really, if they go after anybody, they're going to be able to find some violation. I mean, that to me is the real benefit from the standpoint of government, of both the regulated society and the income tax. That this is the way that they can subtly and indirectly, without making any threats whatsoever, keep big companies in line. And I don't think it's a coincidence that you've got the mass media, the big broadcasting networks, the big newspapers, the big corporations that remain silent at best, like on U.S. foreign policy, or even worse, become sycophantic in terms of supporting whatever the government does, because lurking in the background is always the possibility that the IRS is going to come in and audit you and play like it's all fair and square, and inevitably they will be able to find violations, because there's no way that anybody can stay in compliance with something that complicated. So it's the Damocles sword that the feds have over everybody in society. Stay in line, because we always have the IRS to come after you with.
Right. I mean, in any discussion of the rule of law, one of the first principles that's specified is that people are supposed to be able to know in advance what the law requires of them, and therefore make sure they don't do something that violates the law. I mean, that's considered one of the most basic principles, right, of the idea of a rule of law. And here's such a flagrant violation of that principle. It's virtually impossible to know. Tax experts argue for ages, decades, over provisions in the tax code, because they can't agree. It's a whole industry, of course, and a lot of people are making big bucks in the so-called private sector, dispensing advice and representing taxpayers. Given the system, I'm glad they're there, because they offer some help to people that are trying to minimize their tax. But on the other hand, the whole industry exists only because the government is taxing incomes to begin with. And so it's necessarily very difficult. Look, even in this area of the nonprofit corporations, these 501c4s, the IRS says you can get this exemption if this organization exclusively promotes the public good. They use some term like that, and it exclusively promotes the public good by primarily promoting the general welfare. So at first it says exclusively, and then when it defines what it means to exclusively do something, it's if it primarily does some of that. So what is it, exclusively or primarily? And what's the public good? Why does the IRS get to define the public good? Why isn't promoting, rolling back government power the public good? There's a lot of discretion opened up. As soon as you start taxing incomes and take upon yourself the power to exempt some people or some organizations, you have a tremendous amount of power. And we see it. We're seeing it in this scandal. It's fascinating.
Yeah, and I don't think it's a coincidence that, everybody knows that the Tea Party is sort of rebelling against taxation and the level of taxation and what's going on in America with respect to taxation. I mean, that's sort of one of their core principles. And so when the IRS sees that and says, "Oh, they're challenging our very existence here," they're obviously the Tea Party's not as hardcore as we libertarians, and we would abolish the whole thing. But clearly that has to have played a role here, and when they go and start targeting groups like this. And I think while this discussion is primarily on the income tax, I don't see how we can divorce it from what the income tax funds. Because this is one of the reasons that I think libertarians differ so much from conservatives. Conservatives are making a big deal out of this, but you almost get the feeling that it's a gotcha type of thing. Hey, we got Obama on this, and man, that we can make political hay out of this. We can really hurt him with this scandal and so forth, as they're doing with other scandals. But libertarians we look at it much more in terms of principle. That we say this is the logical outcome of having an income tax, and we want to get rid of it. Well, then that raises what about the things that it funds? And I think that's where your great book, one of the three you've done for the Future of Freedom Foundation, Tethered Citizens, Time to Repeal the Welfare State, comes in, as well as the warfare state, is that we don't believe in all these welfare functions and warfare functions that the federal income tax funds. So we're not stuck like conservatives are. They get stuck because they favor the welfare warfare state. We want to dismantle the welfare warfare state and the income tax that funds it.
Yeah. I'm reminded it works both ways, really, the spending and the taxing. It's bidirectional. There's a great line in Thomas Paine's Rights of Man where he says, looking over the history of the British Empire, it appears to me that the government didn't raise taxes to fight wars. Rather, it fought wars to raise taxes. This is Thomas Paine's, 18th century observation about the British Empire. So I think it can work both ways. These crises, now I'm alluding to Bob Higgs's great book, Crisis and Leviathan. Crises do make it possible to raise taxes because it puts people on edge and they think, oh, government better do something. Okay, I'll acquiesce in higher taxes. If that's what it takes to end this crisis. So it's an interactive thing, and the ruling elite will pick the best path to their goals, and sometimes that's exaggerating or creating a crisis to raise more money, and other times it's just go out and raise the money so that they can fight a war somewhere or dominate some region of the world that so far has escaped adequate attention from the U.S. government.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, once they adopted the income tax, in the Federal Reserve too, the whole floodgates were open for any type of welfare program that they wanted, any type of warfare program they wanted. I mean, the nice thing about that long period of time from 1787 up through 1913, where at least mostly during that period there was no income tax, is that the government lacked the resources to get America involved in these foreign wars, and so they didn't need a big standing army. They didn't need a CIA. They didn't need all these things because, well, they couldn't afford it. They didn't have the money to do it because there was no income tax. But that inured to the benefit of the American people not to be involved in all this foreign shenanigans and welfarism where, the mindset now is, oh, we could never do it without education grants and Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. Nonsense. We would do fantastic without all this welfare and warfare spending.
Yeah, well, they are pretty ingenious. Even when they didn't have an income tax, they still managed to do some stuff. Let's not forget the Spanish-American War. that came after the income tax of 1894 was struck down. So they still managed to do some stuff. But you're right; it certainly puts limits on it. I think it would be difficult to sustain a worldwide empire without an income tax. It brings in a lot of money, and the rates can creep up, and then you get withholding, which takes the pain out of paying taxes. People look forward to refunds in April now. Not now, but I mean since World War II. Instead of feeling the pain of writing a check to the IRS. Imagine if they had to write a check to the IRS that was due the day before Election Day. I think that there would be a minor reform that would probably move somewhat in our direction. But no, instead they make it April, and most people look forward to money. Oh, I'm getting money. Even though they call it a refund, they still act like it's a gift somehow. When actually it's been a year-long interest-free loan to the government. But of course, if you underpay, it may not be interest-free. You may owe interest and penalty for not paying enough during the year. So it's a bit one-sided. But I certainly agree with you. It opened the floodgates. It raises a lot of money. And in addition to that, it gives the government a huge amount of power to manipulate. I mean, we talk about all kinds of exemptions, so-called loopholes, which really on loopholes originally meant an oversight. A law is written and something slipped by, and so someone then can exploit it. That was a loophole. Loophole originally was something unintentional, but these are exemptions and various kinds of tax preferences and deductions that are written into the law. They're policy. And in fact, the government calls them, this goes back to something you said earlier, basically the government owns all our income. Anytime the government lets you keep your money, it's called a tax expenditure. That's a form of government spending. So actually the government's budget is the entire GDP, if you think about it, right? Because anything it lets you keep, that's a form of government spending too. So the whole national income, all of our income just summed up, is the government's budget, if you think of it that way. And anything left in your pocket it's spent that money by letting it stay in your pocket, because it could have taken it and spent it another way. I mean, that's the way they really seem to look at it. But the power to manipulate is unbelievable. Now, we might defend exemptions and various kinds of deductions by saying, well, at least people can keep it's their money, they should be able to keep it. Now, you'd certainly agree with that. But think about how creative and manipulative government can be just through the tax system. You could abolish all regulation, and the courts, I think, have even recognized this, and accomplish the same thing through taxation by letting people keep their money if they do X, but tax the money if they do Y, so you can get them to do X. As John Marshall said, the power to tax is the power to destroy. If it's the power to destroy, it certainly is the power to do lesser things, right, like manipulate and get people to do things. So it's a tremendous power that no government should possess. No free society should permit, any agency to possess this power. It's outrageous, it's immoral, and it's dangerous.
Well, and it inculcates in the citizenry this mindset that the government is responsible for their well-being. I mean, I've heard this before where somebody says, "Oh, well, I wouldn't have gotten my education had it not been the government, because I had government grants and government loans." Well, the way I argue this is, okay, well, let's just suppose your parents lived without income taxation for 20 years, but 2 years before you were born. So that by the time, let's say the average person pays $20,000 a year in income taxes. So by the time the guy graduates from college, there's 20 years times $20,000. That's $400,000. And so you ask the person, is that enough to cover your college bills and your postgraduate studies? Well, $400,000 covers a lot, plus interest of $450,000. And that's what people forget, is that all this largesse that government hands out has been confiscated from the private sector. Massive confiscation of capital. And as we know, stretching all the way back to Adam Smith, Sheldon, capital is the key to rising standards of living, to a wealthy society. This is the key to the wealth of nations, as Smith put it. And yet here you have government confiscating this massive wealth and then inculcating the sense of helpless dependency among the citizenry.
Right, and it lets the government look like it's being benevolent and giving you something when it exempts something or gives a deduction for some activity. But of course, it really It doesn't do that. David Friedman, I think, has said at some time that the government's so incompetent it really can't even give things away. So take the mortgage interest deduction. Everybody thinks, oh, okay, we can't get rid of the mortgage interest deduction. We need mortgage interest deduction, and even the realtors advertise on TV how we have to preserve this because it makes housing affordable. But let's use a little economics. If you let people deduct the mortgage interest from that, just stimulates demand for housing, which pushes the price up. Canada doesn't have mortgage interest deduction, but their housing market is not different from ours. The degree of ownership is equivalent to us. So it just stands to reason if the government's going to promote demand for housing, the price is going to go up and wipe out any benefit you thought you were getting. But it still looks benevolent, right? Well, I'm going to let you deduct your mortgage interest from your income. You won't get taxed on that. So it looks like it's done us a nice favor. The politicians get to bask in that, and yet they haven't really done us any favor. But of course, it's not that it's not the exemption per se I'm against. I'm against the income tax. Then there are no exemptions because everything's a 100% exemption, and you don't have to ask for it.
Well, right. I see every one of those deductions as just manipulation. To me, the whole income tax system is control and manipulation of people. And if you're not directly controlling them, you're manipulating them, what they do with their money. And I think what we've got to do, and what we do as libertarians, is we raise people's vision to a higher level that you can have a society without income taxation. I mean, that was my point about the 120 years deal, is that you really can have a society without income taxation. You can get along fine. In fact, you get along much better. But I think more important, you cannot have a society that's free as long as you have an income tax in the midst of it. And I think that's what we need to keep, raising people's vision to, Sheldon, to be discussing and debating things like, what is the nature of freedom? What does it mean to be free? Because a lot of Americans are under the conception that as long as they can go to work every morning and get, 3 weeks of vacation in the summer, boy, they're living lives of freedom. And what we libertarians argue is this is not necessarily freedom. Freedom involves much more than just, going on vacation. People in Cuba go on vacation. The freedom involves, at a very minimum, the right to keep everything you earn and decide for yourself what to do with it. And so, obviously, we oppose mandatory charity as well, because freedom involves that principle.
Yeah, that's exactly right. It's put in terms of charity, but it's not charity if it's coerced. And all these things end up resting on coercion. So you get this government seizing of scarce resources. You get the power to manipulate by exempting certain activities, and you have this grand inquisitor who's always sitting there watching you, and you can be called before it at any time by getting an audit letter. So that seems like a pretty three strikes and you're out. It looks like to me. You got this grand theft, manipulation of our economic activities and all of our activities, and the Grand Inquisitor. I mean, what could be worse than an institution? And again, I don't just blame the IRS. It's Congress. Congress could repeal it tomorrow if they wanted to. What could be worse than something that embodies those three features? I mean, it's hard to think of something. And then, of course, fuels war in foreign lands.
Yeah, really, when you start to think about it, the income tax incorporates just about every wrongful thing, every thing that's antithetical to a free society. It infringes on people's freedom, their privacy. It gives government a mastery and of control over the citizenry. Gives the government the ability to do whatever it wants with respect to welfare and warfare. And it really makes the citizen the subject, and government the master. I mean, you couldn't have, to me, a better example of a violation of the principles of freedom than the income tax. Anyway, that's the show, Sheldon. We run out of time, and it's always great to interact with you here. Those of you that listen into this broadcast, we've got the ebook version of Sheldon's great book, Your Money or Your Life, Why We Must Abolish the Income Tax. Highly recommend it. And it's, like I say, it gives a great summary of the history and the nature of the income tax, why we really need to do what we need to do to abolish it to achieve a free society. And also, Sheldon wrote a great op-ed last week that is now on our website called abolish the IRS and the income tax. So what we're trying to do is raise your vision to a higher level here in terms of achieving a free society. And that's, of course, what all of us libertarians are trying to do. That's the show. Thanks so much for listening in, and we'll see y'all next week.